Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind had been pressing against the cabin for hours, slipping through the narrow gaps in the old wooden boards and carrying the sharp smell of frozen earth. Elias Thornton stood near the stove, rubbing warmth back into his hands while the lantern on the table flickered with each draft. He kept the room dim to save kerosene, the light stretching just far enough to touch the door and the stack of firewood beside it. When the wind rose again, rattling the latch, he decided it was time to bring the last of the wood inside before the cold grew worse. He pulled on his coat, feeling the familiar stiffness in his left shoulder from a years-old injury, and walked toward the door with slow, measured steps. He didn't hurry anymore. Life out here had stripped the rush out of him. Before opening the door, he paused out of habit, listening. Nothing but the wind scraping over the roof and the faint creak of tree branches. He unlatched the door and opened it just wide enough to slip through, and that was when he froze. A shape lay slumped against the step. At first, he thought it was a bundle of old cloth blown by the wind. Then the lantern light stretched across the doorway, touching skin, tangled hair, and the trembling rise of a breath. A woman. Elias set the firewood down so quickly that one piece rolled across the floor. He crouched, the cold biting through his knees as he leaned closer. The woman lay curled on her side, one arm tucked under her, the other extended toward the threshold, as if she had been reaching for the door when her strength failed. Her bare feet were scraped raw, the skin cracked from cold and rough ground. The hem of her dress was torn, the dirt ground into the seams. Her face was half hidden by her hair, but he saw her eyelids flutter when he touched her shoulder with the back of his hand. Her skin was cold enough to make him tense. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet but firm, meant not to startle. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened a little, unfocused at first, then widening with fear the moment she saw him. She tried to push herself up, but her arm shook uncontrollably, and she couldn't lift her own weight. Panic flashed through her expression, a short, sharp reaction that reminded Elias of someone running too long with no rest and expecting the worst from whoever found them. "It's all right," he said, keeping his voice steady and low. "You're safe. I'm just getting you out of the cold." He slid his arms under her carefully, noting how light she felt, how she flinched when his hands brushed the rope burns on her wrists. Her breath came fast and uneven, like she feared each second would end in pain. Elias lifted her inside, adjusting his grip when she sagged against him. A wave of cold air followed them through the doorway as he carried her toward the bed near the stove. He lowered her slowly, making sure her head rested against the folded blanket. She watched him with wide, wary eyes, her chest rising quickly under the torn dress. She looked afraid to speak, afraid not to, afraid of what he might demand. Elias took a step back as soon as she was settled. He didn't want her feeling cornered. He reached for another blanket, shook off the dust, and draped it over her shoulders. She held the edges tightly, knuckles pale, as if the blanket itself might be taken from her. "What happened to you?" he asked softly, watching her reaction more than listening for details. Her lips parted, but she hesitated, swallowing hard. "Camp," she whispered. "Forced work? Men, hunting." Her voice broke off there, not from emotion, more like exhaustion cutting her words short. Elias nodded once, accepting what she could give. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't look at her injuries longer than necessary. He kept his focus on practical things, feeding the fire, warming the cabin, closing the door properly to lock out the cold. But inside, his thoughts moved fast and controlled. Forced labor, raiders, pursuit. This wasn't a small matter. Whoever chased her was likely close. His solitude had kept him safe for years, but now someone wounded and hunted lay in his bed. And he wasn't about to put her back out in the cold. He filled a cup with water warmed near the stove and placed it within her reach. She didn't take it immediately. Her eyes flicked from the cup to his face, waiting to see what came next. Elias recognized that look, the kind that came from too much mistreatment, too much expecting danger from every direction. "You don't owe me anything," he said, anticipating the fear behind her hesitation. "Just drink if you can." Her fingers trembled when she picked up the cup. She sipped slowly, coughing once as the warm water hit her throat. Elias watched the rise and fall of her breathing, noting how each inhale steadied a little after the water. When she lowered the cup, her gaze drifted across the room. She took in the layout, the stove, the table, the door, the rifle in the corner, and he could almost see her measuring the distance, checking escape routes, preparing for the worst. It was the same kind of thinking he lived with every day, though for different reasons. He sat on the edge of the chair, near the table, not facing her directly, giving her enough space to feel the room wasn't closing in on her. She pulled the blanket closer and asked, voice barely audible, "You won't hurt me?" "No," Elias said simply. "Not ever." The certainty in his tone surprised even him, but he meant it fully. Asha's shoulders lowered slightly, not relaxed but less rigid. She shifted under the blanket, trying to ease the sharp sting in her scraped feet. Elias stood and fetched a small cloth, dipping it in warm water. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her feet. She hesitated again, then nodded once. He cleaned the worst of the dirt from her skin, careful not to touch more than he had to. She winced a few times but didn't pull back. The longer he worked, the more her breathing slowed, fear giving way to exhaustion. "Rest," he said quietly. "You're safe for now." She lay back against the pillow, her eyes drifting closed but opening every few seconds as if checking he was still across the room and not closer. Elias returned to the table, watching the frost creep across the window as the storm outside strengthened. His heart beat a little harder than usual, not from fear of danger, but from the strange weight of responsibility settling in. He had lived alone for years, shutting the world out to avoid causing harm or bringing trouble back on himself. Now, a half-frozen woman lay in his bed, hunted and terrified, and he was the only barrier between her and whatever she had escaped. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wouldn't let her die at his doorstep. A faint gray light pushed through the small window by the time Asha woke. The inside of the cabin was warmer than the night before, the steady crackle of the stove filling the silence with a calm, rhythmic sound. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Her body tensed, her breath catching her throat, her eyes scanning the room fast. Door, table, stove, shadows. Then she saw Elias. He was standing near the stove, sleeves rolled up slightly, stirring something in a tin pot with slow, even movements. He wasn't looking at her. He hadn't noticed she was awake yet. His posture was quiet, settled, as if he had been standing there for some time, without rushing through anything. Asha pushed herself up on her elbows. The blanket slipped slightly, and she grabbed it fast, pulling it to her chest. The motion made the mattress creak. Elias turned at the sound, and their eyes met. "You're awake," he said, tone steady, not surprised or overly gentle, just clear and calm. "How are you feeling?" She shifted against the pillow, testing her arms, her legs. Everything ached in a dull, constant way. "Hurts," she admitted. Her voice was rough, still carrying the dryness of last night's struggle. He nodded once. "Pain means you're warming up. Better than how I found you." The memory of collapsing at his door flickered across her mind, sharp and disturbing. She tightened her grip on the blanket and looked down. Elias didn't step closer. Instead, he kept his distance, giving her room to breathe. "I've got food heating," he said. "Something light. You haven't eaten in a while." Asha watched him for a long moment. She didn't know his habits yet. She didn't know what he expected or what he might demand. But so far, he hadn't acted like the men from the camp. He hadn't grabbed her. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't spoken in ways that made her flinch. Still, she stayed cautious. "Where am I?" she asked, eyes drifting to the window. "Foot of the northern hills," he answered. "Cabin's mine. Nearest town's half a day east. This place stays quiet." She nodded slowly. Her breathing felt steadier now, the tightness in her chest loosening. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders and eased her legs toward the edge of the bed. Elias set the pot aside and turned toward her. "Take it slow," he said. "You stood yesterday, but your legs won't hold much yet." Asha paused, studying his face carefully. He wasn't lecturing her. He wasn't giving orders. It sounded more like a warning from someone who had seen too many people push themselves too fast. She swung her legs down anyway.